All right, thank you so much, Katie. Katie Sievers from AdeptID. Thank you for coming to speak to us about credentialing and skill-based hiring in the labor market. As you know, the labor market is a very complex issue and it's very complicated at the moment. A lot of job seekers feel very frustrated with the credentials that they have. Some of them have master's degree, PhDs, doctorates of different sort. They have bachelor's degrees. Some of them have extensive experiences in the labor market. And they're feeling frustrated because they apply for jobs and they don't get interviews, or they get interviews and they don't move forward in the hiring process. So before we even get into it, I would like to introduce you, Katie. So I would say a little bit about Katie. So I met Katie virtually through the Digital Badge Academy with Jim Daniels and David Leeser. They interviewed Katie, and I just happened to surf across YouTube, and I came across the Digital Badge Academy channel. And I said, okay, this is interesting. Let me find out what they do, because I mean, credentialing is my area of research and practice. So I clicked on it, and there you go. I saw Katie's interview. And I said, wow, this is great. I listened to it. I was like, man, it's a great brain behind credentialing, and I would love to discuss credentialing with you on a particular meeting, professional development series. So here we are. So a little bit about Katie. So Katie got her master's degree in education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Katie is more like the skills first transformation. She's more like a consultant and also the expert in knowledge when it comes to skills first transformation. She also worked to expand opportunities for people in the labor market. Now, a little bit about Katie. Katie is a research fellow at Columbia University, right? You still do that? Research fellows?
Not anymore, but it was
Oh,
a
you concluded.
pleasure to work with
Okay,
them. Yeah.
great. And she's also worked with Credly, which was bought by Pearson, right? So before they were bought by Pearson, you worked with them. And then you are currently a teaching fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So great. This is some of Katie's credentials and qualifications. So we are happy for you to be here. So Katie, let me ask you, let me allow you to talk about the work that you do at AdeptID. Let me allow you to talk a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quayson, for having me. It's a pleasure to finally get to interact with you live. But a little bit about kind of my journey to Adept and what we do. I started my career working in higher ed. I worked in study abroad, and I was partnering with hundreds of universities across the US to send students to our program in Greece. And as I was working with all of these universities, I realized they were all kind of facing the same challenges, not using resources really effectively, not making use of the student talent they had on campus. It's like, I'm going to go get my master's and like figure out how to solve higher ed's problems. And so I started my master's with the intent of staying in higher ed administration, and took one history of higher ed class and was kind of like, this is a very important space to focus on, but it's not really the world that I want to spend all of my energy trying to transform. Where else is disruption happening? And at the same time, I was looking at kind of emerging technologies and kind of innovations around AR, VR, AI, blockchain at the time. This is like 2018. And I was like, where can I combine my interests in kind of disruptive post-secondary education and emerging technology? And the intersection point that I decided to focus on was digital credentials. And what I found really compelling about digital credentials specifically is that, like, we know that a lot of the, tools that we use on a daily basis run on data. And all of, we think about like Google Maps, it gets us from point A to point B because it has a ton of data around like where people are going and how long it's taking them to get there. We, are so used to just having streamlined, tools that know a lot about us and are able to give us really smart recommendations because they have great data behind it. Where that doesn't seem to be the case is in the skills and talent marketplace. And that's to your point about the friction from both the job seeker side and the hiring manager side. Like, people are having a really hard time matching talent to opportunity. And, digital credentials, in my mind, at the time and still, are a really great way to create skills data, like to create information about people that can feed other systems and help us make better recommendations. And so I started at Credly as a customer success manager, worked with hundreds of credential issuing organizations. So think associations, higher ed institutions, and other training providers, employers themselves, products and their certifications. And so I really got exposed to lots of different types of credentials and started to understand kind of the credentialing landscape, and that there are lots of different types of credentials creating lots of different types of data about us. And what we're kind of hoping, the promise of credentials, is that it unlocks opportunity, right? Like that's why we do what we do in the credentialing world, because we hope that these credentials are having an impact on people's career trajectories. But where that breaks down when the rubber hits the road is that employers who are looking at these credentials often don't really understand how to interpret this data. And so from, the power of data standpoint, the promise isn't really being met because we haven't done the work of interpreting this data in a way that makes sense for employers. And so I was seeing this challenge, this kind of like promise unfulfilled from the credential issuing side. I was like, where in this landscape is there more of the kind of like rubber hits the road impact happening? And it's within the HR technologies that employers, hiring managers, staffing firms are using every day to find talent. And so I met the founder of AdeptID at a conference, was having this kind of same conversation. He's like, we work directly with those tools. And so AdeptID actually offers AI for talent matching. And their partners are those HR technologies and staffing platforms that, tens of millions of people use, every month. And so we integrate directly with those tools and are doing the translation work that doesn't typically happen in the credentialing world. We're leveraging all of that rich data from credentials, from people's, work experience, from their education, and the powerful information packed into, a higher ed diploma. But we're combining all of that information and we're pumping out into the system that people are using the answer to the question, who is the best fit for this job? And so in that way, we're directly connected to the problem of, this disconnect between talent and opportunities and that matching challenge. And, we're, I think, on track to hit like 16 million people who are using platforms that use our tech. We're impacting 15 million matches, over the course of our lifespan, which is a pretty significant portion of the labor market. So we're starting to see that impact play out. But that's kind of the nutshell of like what we do and how I got here. Feel free to guide us wherever you'd like from here.
Yeah, that is amazing. I mean, you touched on a lot of the questions that I had. And so speaking on AI, we're gonna get back to that because I have a lot of questions. And one of the questions that I had for AI was, are we lacking transparency and explainability when it comes to our use of AI in the labor market? Maybe you can answer that and we'll move forward.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. It's a really important one because it has ramifications for bias and equity of the solutions that we're using. If we can't explain the why behind the insights we're pumping out, like it's really easy to sneak bias in there. And so, at AdeptID, we take the stance, and I personally take the stance that like, in order to create a biased solution, you need to be able to explain transparently how your kind of system is coming up with those answers. And so the way we do that at Adept is kind of multifold. We have our models audited for bias directly by Credo AI, which is a fantastic AI auditing firm. They help us also stay compliant with local regulations because it's not just like an ethical problem, like it's, a policy one. There's pretty rigorous HR policies now around use of AI when you're making, decisions that impact people's opportunities. And so we have our models audited, and even beyond that, we go further than the regulations require us to because we care a lot about this. But also when we're pumping out the kind of outputs of our model, we're always including that why. Our models include lots of different types of information about people. I mentioned a few of them earlier. people's work history. How likely is it, based on someone's work history, that the job they're applying for is, going to be their next step? That model can kind of tell us the answer to that question. Education. How likely is it that someone with this education is qualified for the role that they're applying to, or likely to kind of obtain that position? That model tells us that. We also have models around skills, around, time of experience, all of these things that answer different questions. And we combine all of those answers and basically weight the importance of the question to the context. So for a job that doesn't require a formal degree, the education question isn't likely to be that important because it's not required for that job. But what we're doing then is explaining that in the results. We have each kind of the answer to each question is a separate response in our models. And so when people are saying, why, from what perspective is, Felix a good job for this, professor role? Well, from a work history standpoint, you've been doing this, you're probably likely to continue that career trajectory. From an education standpoint, you have, doctorates, you're likely to be a good fit for those roles that are requiring doctorates. So we can kind of explain it at that level. But to take that a step further, because that's all still quite technical, we also provide a kind of narrative response, and that makes it human readable. We're not all data scientists and software engineers. We're not all going to be looking at the technical responses here. We're providing these answers to real humans who are looking at their screen and trying to make sense of this information. So we can say in human language, Felix does a really great job based on his work history and experience in X, Y, and Z position. He has overlapping skills in these areas. And if he's going to be considered for this role, he might have an opportunity to upskill in this area as well. And we can say that literally those words and give that answer to the user. And so from a explainability standpoint, we mean that both on the technical and the human level. More broadly, though, AdeptID is one of the solutions that is, an AI solution in this landscape. And the reason I say this, and I'm speaking at it in such detail, is that not everybody's doing that. And I think it's really important to hold folks accountable so that, we aren't expecting that, basically we are expecting that people are doing the same things that we are. We don't really, we don't shy away from those hard questions about bias and about the fairness of our models, because we want to lead in that way by example. So that's kind of why I'm speaking at length about it now.
No, this is great. This is oh my God. I'm having mind blow right now. I'm like, oh, this is a great conversation. So just for our viewers to, go to AdeptID, is it a pay service that they have to pay out of pocket for the services that you just mentioned?
So our partners, people who
Mhm.
pay us, are the kind of technologies
Okay.
themselves. And so that's very intentional. We kind of have the mindset that we want to get in the water, be as widely spread as possible. And the way to do that is to get into systems that already have millions of users. And
Okay.
so that's how we're monetized. Individuals don't pay us.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you for that clarification. Just wanted to put it out there. So when it comes to skills first movement, the skills based hiring market at the moment in the labor market, we often look at what people have done versus what people can do, right? So would you speak a little bit about um, how do we train people? So what I want to get at is, do we start first with skills-based hiring or skills-based training?
Mm, I love that. I love that question. So it's a really well-timed question, actually. I just got back from a convening of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Talent Pipeline Management program. If you're not familiar, it's worth a Google. They do incredible work to facilitate basically skills-based hiring and advancement within specific regions and industries. And they really center the employer. The reason I'm starting there is because I think it has to be both sides, and I think it has to start with the demand side. That said, many employers don't know what skills-based hiring means tactically. There's a
Mm,
great report put out, I think probably about a year ago now, by Harvard Project on Workforce and Burning Glass Institute, which studied, of the organizations that say they're skills-based, where are we actually seeing that promise fulfilled, in the sense that like people are hired on the basis of their skills and not necessarily a degree, if a degree isn't required for the job. And so degree in that sense is considered kind of a proxy. Most of the hiring decisions were still based on those proxies. Most organizations were not actually doing the skills-based hiring stuff that they said they wanted to do. And so I think the way to think about skills-based hiring from the employer side is more around really questioning the requirements of the jobs and creating job descriptions that are based on, what is actually the required capability, what is preferred, or maybe like, a bonus. And if you're going to be listing a degree, like really critically thinking about whether that is like a requirement because of the skills and knowledge someone brings in through that degree experience, or if you're using that as a proxy for other things. And so the talent pipeline management program, I think is a really cool model because it convenes employers who are hiring for similar roles, has them bring their job descriptions to the table, and really gets to work on saying like, what is an actual requirement for the job? How can we align the skills that we're asking for across our industry so that then we can go to the talent suppliers, the education institutions, and say, these are the skills we need. This is how many people we're going to need with these skills in the next few years. Create this talent for us. And that's the impetus for creating the skills-based program side of the equation. And so when you lead in that way, I think it prevents that kind of disconnect, which I think is felt pretty acutely, especially to the point you mentioned out of the gate, like a lot of very highly credentialed people coming through, advanced degree programs and popping out into the workforce that like doesn't know what to do with them, because the programs are not always like aligned to labor market demand. When you're coming out of a program that is centered on the labor market demand, you're more likely to be, found and hired by people who actually need the skills that you possess. So I think it's a both and I think it has to start with the demand side, being really clear about what they need.
wow, that's something that I've suspected in a long time. But thank you for bringing my attention back to it again. So you spoke a lot about employers, that it has to be on both sides, with training and hiring. Now, my next question is, I believe that the skills-based hiring culture has to do a lot with change management at the top up, and then it kind of trickled down to the bottom. So with the agency like AdeptID, the work that you guys are doing, is very important, providing data to employers, that can lead to transparent hiring culture. Now, if we aren't giving the correct data to employers, then they can make the right change management decisions when it comes to hiring the right candidate. So my next question to you, Katie, is how do we train people to fit into the right models that can predict success in the labor market?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a problem right now that leads to the behaviors that we see, which is people relying on proxy, network, whatever else to find the talent they need, is that our tools are actually built, like the tools we use to hire people, LinkedIn, most applicant tracking systems, they assume that talent looks a certain way. They assume that people have bachelor's degrees most often. They assume they have linear career paths. They assume they've listed all of their skills and capabilities on their resume. Like, that's not the majority of people. Like the majority of the workforce, which is like what, 164 million people,
Hmm.
doesn't have, is either partial or no formal education, has very irregular career trajectories, doesn't list all their skills. There's a lot of like kind of unwritten capabilities under the surface. Yet the systems that we're using to make decisions like are looking for people based on keywords, job description versus resume, or current or prior job title. And those are just not clean ways of sifting through and finding talent. So from a change
Okay.
management standpoint, if you're thinking about behaviors and you're thinking about like how to impact people's like actions, like what limits are we putting into the tech that they are using? And if we can kind of take some of those limitations away and let them find talent by, inferencing instead of direct keyword matching. For example, if you're a expert communicator, you might also have, empathy, you might have, listening, active listening skills, but you probably aren't writing all three of those things on your resume. You might just be listing one. If people are looking for active listening and you wrote communication and you're just relying on keywords, you're falling through the cracks. And so how can we
Ah,
expose talent by making all of those kind of like hidden abilities more visible and allowing people to take, action on them in the flow of their work. And so some of that relies on the tools and the limitations of the tools, the assumptions the tools are making. So that's one piece of it. But the other piece is like at the end of the day, it's a human making a decision about another human. And like they're going to do that on a very like, emotional level. And so even if the technology finds you the perfect candidate, it allows you to find the diamond in the rough, who you wouldn't have otherwise found based on keywords. Like at the end of the day, if you haven't aligned your heart and mind around the fact that you're looking for someone who has these skills and that person might look, from their background or their demography, very different than what you expect to have in that role, you're still going to make a biased hiring decision. And so
yeah.
like there's this kind of technology change management of incorporating the right tools, but there's also that human change management that, we all care deeply, deeply about, which is like, what assumptions should we be made aware of that we are making? And how do we challenge those more actively? And, there's tons of methodologies around that. But I think that you have to tackle both for like real change to happen.
That is so good. That brings me back to in our department here at Texas State, we have something called credit for prior learning.
Mhm.
We used to call it PLA. We allow students that or adults that have significant amount of experiences in their professional life to come back to school, and then they take a course called prior learning assessment, and then they're able to write competency statements. So those competency statements gets evaluated by faculty, our department faculty. And then we have a metric where faculty assign numbers to it,
Mhm.
categorical numbers to it. And at the end of the evaluation, the system will tally the numbers and ascribe each student how many credits they were able to get. So that kind of brings me, so a lot of people, the reason why I'm bringing that is a lot of people weren't able to specifically write well with
Mm.
your qualifications because they have 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. They aren't able to write those keywords that you mentioned that maybe the faculty metric is kind of indicating, but they have it, but they are not
Yeah.
able to write it on paper, right? So we call that as an equitable problem that we had in our PLA system, and our department is working vigilantly to resolve that. So thank you for bringing that. That means a lot. Um, Going to my next question. How do we get employers to adapt to credentials? And how do we get people into the most valuable credentials for
Yeah, great questions all across the board
them?
here. Well, first, just to your point about people not being very good at explaining what they're good at, there's a lot of initiatives that are focused on that right now. One that I'm thinking of is Education Design Lab's Skills Validation Network. You're probably familiar, but what they do is give people various ways of demonstrating their abilities, and then they issue a credential that verifies it. And that credential is packed with that language that the learner can use in those kinds of competency statements. So there's lots of ways to just give people that language through the credentials themselves. But to answer your question, how do we get employers to adopt credentials? I'll start there. I think it's a pipe dream to expect that employers are going to understand and appreciate the long tail of non-degree credentials. What we do know they're asking for are specific certifications, specific licenses, things that I'll call like qualifying credentials. And they already ask for those. And oftentimes, like people are already listing those in their resume. So I think like the important thing to consider is how do we make all of the other credentials people earn, including those ones I just mentioned through like Education Design Lab,
Mhm.
actually meaningful to the person's application? How do we get them to count if they're not being explicitly requested by the employer? And I think that's where, the technology approach, I guess, would be incorporating that into the matching algorithm, which is like work that we're doing with Equos right now, is another organization that's focused on credential quality outcomes. The kind of under the surface of the waterline approach, understanding the credential and then giving the employer the answer that they're looking for, which again is this person a good fit based on everything we know about them? So I think you can be subtle in how you're getting that, I guess, credential information into their consideration, without putting the expectation and demand on them to do that heavy lifting of like looking into every single credential that someone possesses. On the flip side, how do we get people to earn the right credentials for them? Equos, which I just mentioned, has part of that as their intent. They've been researching the kind of different dimensions of quality of specific credentials in order to say exactly that, based on the demand for this credential and the, maybe employment outcomes, is this specific credential right for you at the right time? Well, it is if you're looking for that employment outcome. Might not be the right one for you if you're looking for a different employment outcome or a different set of skills. So just providing more, I guess, structured data around what goals are being attained after people earn a credential, is, I think, step one for that process. And that's really hard to do because a lot of times credentialing programs don't have a really easy way of capturing that outcomes data, as I'm sure you know very well.
Yeah.
And so CredLens is another, initiative that's focused on tackling that same challenge. It's just a lot of people are focusing on how do we create that structured outcomes data so that we can better inform learners as consumers of credentials. So I know we're short on time, so I'll wrap that up there.
Yeah, we are. And I'm just gonna, like I said, I had a lot of questions, dissertation and thesis style questions, but we won't be able to get into a lot of them. I have a whole page left. The next one that I want to ask you, because I know you mentioned about, institutions and their programs, and they're not, able to capture that specific skills validation well. I know you know a lot about assessment, okay, because you work around that industry. And assessment doesn't necessarily mean it has to be testing, which a lot of people think is testing. No, it doesn't. Assessment can be something like, okay, I finished this degree. I want to self-assess myself to know where I stand when it comes to my skills level. It can definitely unmask your strengths and weaknesses for you to know where you stand and where you can actually go back to credentialing yourself or learning more skills to be able to be competitive for the labor market. So my whole thing is, how do we align learning to skills validation? How do we do it?
Mm, yeah, well, the first question, I guess, is like, is the outcome that you're looking for actual skill demonstration or is it knowledge? Like those are different types of assessment. And so
Hmm.
being really crisp on like what you want like what are the intended outcomes, and then aligning the assessments to those appropriate outcomes. And also thinking about what is the most authentic way to validate that specific outcome. Like how do you assess communication? Like you wouldn't like verbal communication. You wouldn't assess verbal communication via a written test. Like you'd want to put someone on the spot and have them verbally communicating. And so I'm thinking
Yeah,
about like what is an authentic way of evaluating that particular outcome. And thinking about like, there's a lot of focus in the especially certification world around assessment validation, assessment reliability. If you're using a test, especially like making sure that you're just kind of testing whether your own test is reliable and valid. But the kind of broader question around like, are you testing the right things if you're hoping to test, verbal communication? And are you testing it in a way that everyone's gonna have a consistent result, depending on their according like, skill level? So I think authenticity is like the top of my list when I'm thinking about that, but it all starts with being extremely rigorous when you're describing the outcomes that you're trying to evaluate in the first place. And I think that's actually not as commonly done as we would in the education world expect. Like, of course, we're all writing syllabi and like we write our learning outcomes, at the top of the page. But
Yeah.
not every training provider is thinking about it necessarily as crisply as that. And the, assessment type, as you mentioned, varies so drastically. Think about portfolios, you think about workplace, experiences. So I think there's lots of ways. And at the end of the day, we just want to make sure that we're authentically giving people a chance to demonstrate what we're hoping they can achieve.
Thank you so much, Katie. I know I won't take any more of your time. It's past 30 minutes, and I want to thank you for your time. And hopefully, we'll get to speak again. This has been an
Yeah.
interesting conversation. I love the interaction, the questions, and the discussion. So thank you so much, and I wish you nothing but the best. And I will continue to follow you on LinkedIn, and we will continue to communicate. In the meantime, does Dr. Francis have anything to say? Any questions to ask?
No, not at this time. I think all the right questions were asked and answered, and I'm very intrigued. So I hope to follow up in the future to ask my own personal questions if that is needed. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Francis, I would love to hear what you're working on too and what your interest in this space is. So hopefully I'll hear from you soon.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Quayson, for this opportunity. It was a really great conversation.
Thank you so much, Katie.
All
And I will
right.
stop the recording now.